Hey there everyone, welcome back to Dan Cave and welcome to part 2 of the video build series of the Fujimi 20th scale Lotus 97T. So this is part 2, so part 1 obviously got the bodywork all kind of prepped, primed, painted, deckled and clear coated. So this video, we're going to have a look at we'll say the engine kind of floor pan, beginnings of the work on the chassis as well. So that's going to be this video. Fairly short. I think the actual footage is about 12-15 minutes. So I'm going to keep the intro fairly short. So this is part 2. So this was Senna's first winning car, Lotus 97T, which won the Portuguese Grand Prix in 1985. So this course was Senna's second season in Formula 1, having driven for Toleman the season before, but picked up his first win with the Lotus. Did have a few podiums with the Toleman. I think three podiums. Check my notes. Yeah, 3 podiums with Toleman. But it wasn't until he got to the second race of the season in Portugal with the Lotus that he finally picked up his first win. Now that season, of course, he ended up finishing 4th in the championship. Probably would have finished higher up and not been for a lot of retirements. He did pick up a couple of wins, a few other podiums as well, but there was a lot of retirements. But however, his first win, one of his best as well, pretty much lapped everyone in the race all the way up to 3rd place, I think. So yes, it was a huge margin ahead of everyone else in this wet race. So however, that's me just waffling on about the history of Senna and this Lotus 97T. So let's dive on over to the bench and see how this part progresses. I'll be back at the end for some final thoughts. So let's dive into the box and start pulling out some sprues. So once again, I'm using Google Translate to figure out which parts will go on this Portuguese GP version. There is some differences on the engine compared to the Belgian Grand Prix, as the other version you can build. So as is usual, I'm starting to clip parts off the sprue. These will all be for the kind of engine, rear suspension, rear brakes, because that's all kind of fitted together as almost one piece. Usual cleanup process using some files just to remove the sprue attachment points and some UMP sanders as well. So as I've mentioned before, some of the parts are extremely fragile. So these stays for the rear diffuser I have managed to break. So I'm just using a small piece of brass tube just to join them back together. Not perfect, it's not a highly visible area, so you can kind of get away with it, and it gives it a little bit of strength. So as I said, some UMP sanding sticks just to clean up any seam lines, any sprue attachment points, but be very, very careful on these smaller parts because they are very, very fragile. But as long as they survive, do the clean up and get them all prepped. So once again, there is a huge amount of parts in and around the exhausts, the radiator, the turbo. So all these parts are cleaned up as well at the same time. And as you can see, I'm using small tubs just basically to break down all those parts into sub-assemblies. They can be set aside for later. And then it's on to cleaning up the floor, basically. So there's some pin injector marks, which I'm using a chisel just to remove some of the remnants of the injector marks, and then sand it back flat. Sometimes the injector pin marks will sit proud of the surface. Sometimes they'll be sunken and you might need to use some filler. But because this area is kind of under the engine, not highly visible, but reasonably visible, it's worth cleaning them up anyway. So once all that cleanup is done, I can start assembling some of those parts. So the 2 main parts of the engine block and gearbox, they'll just get glued together using some Tamiya Extra Thin mixed with EMA Plasti-Weld. And once all those kind of sub-assemblies are, well, there's not a huge amount of sub-assemblies, but a few parts glued together. The rest are mounted, and then everything is over to spray booth for priming. Mainly in UMP black. Actually, pretty much all in UMP black, actually. Shot through the UMP Apex airbrush at about 30 psi. So a couple of coats of black primer. That gets everything absolutely sorted. And once that primer is down, it can be set aside for about 24 hours. And of course, don't forget to prime the floor as well. Now, as there's a lot of parts already cleaned up and ready, I'm also priming the monocoque as well. So this will be set aside and won't be touched in this part. We'll pick this up in the next part, in part 3. But it is primed at this time as well as all the other parts. Because as you can imagine, there's a huge stash of parts all ready to be primed in black primer. So might as well get them all ready around the same time. So of course, once the primer itself has had some time to cure, about 24 hours, it's time to start laying down some base colors. So for the engine block, I'm using Alclads. The main part of the block, I'm using a different shade from the gearbox. The gearbox, I'm sure I use Alclad Steel, which means on the engine block I've used a different color, and I can't remember which one. But however, so the metallics are laid down. Rocker covers are in a semi-gloss black. And as you can see, we're going back to cover the gearbox. So brake discs and wheel hubs, they're getting painted in Alclad Steel. And then the calipers themselves are in Pro Scale Titanium Gold. So again, having a good range of metallics gives a nice kind of visual contrast in certain areas. It can be quite subtle as well. I mean, on the engine and gearbox, it is reasonably subtle between the steel on the gearbox and the whatever color I used on the block. But once that's nicely cured, there's a little bit of brush painting just to add some of the detail on the accessory belts on the end of the block. So once I'm satisfied all those parts have been suitably painted up, I can actually start assembling these components together. So the upper part of the wishbone gets attached to the top of the gearbox. Rocker covers can be added. All just added with some CA glue. The remainder of the rear suspension can get added as well. And then we have the individual wheel hubs with their poly caps placed in as well. So we got the wheel hubs with the disc assembly as well, and then the caliper that sits on. They then have to basically meet at 3 or 4 locating points on the rear suspension arms, and that's the rear brake assembly in place and rear drive shafts in place. And as you can see, that goes together very, very neatly. So once all that is put together, it's time to put a little bit of a wash on it as well. So again, it's not to make the engine look dirty, it's just to basically highlight the details around the engine and gearbox area. So I'm using Ammo's dark wash, I think it is. So using a long liner brush just to run the wash in around any of the recessed areas. Once it's cured, I'll come back and clean up any excess with some odorless mineral spirits and a cotton bud. So this step does add a great deal of depth to the engine. So for the floor area, there is a little bit of painting required as well. So to do that, I need to get masking up around certain areas as well. And as you can see, I'm masking out that middle area, and that's going to be painted in Alclad aluminium. So you can clearly see from the reference pictures, there's some kind of aluminium plating, which will probably be sat under the exhausts. So once it's masked up, over to the spray booth, and lay down some alclad aluminium. So I've been really liking the alclad paints lately, or at least the A stand version of them. Ready to spray out of the bottle as well, so they're very, very handy to use. So once that is cured, you can remove the masking tape, and then it's time to apply some bare metal foil, which will act as a heat shield. And again, just gives that metallic kind of visual difference to the aluminium paint that was laid down in the previous step. So just cutting out some appropriately size squares will actually cut them to shape on the kit itself. Begin by lining up one of the straight edges, and then burnish down the bare metal foil into the recessed area that we want. And then using a sharp new scalpel blade, just trim off the excess where we don't need it. So it's one of the few areas that I'll still use bare metal foil. Try not to use it for any metal trim anymore. I think some of the metallic paints out there give a better finish. And as you can see, that bare metal foil is basking in the evening sunshine glow that's coming through my window. So once both sides are done, I'm just going to burnish them down using a cotton bud. Try to remove any creases. I mean, don't forget, it's not a highly visible part. Doesn't need to be perfect, but it does kind of add to the kind of depth of the engine bay area. So there's a few other parts in and around the radiators, so they need to be painted in semi-gloss black. So that's using Tamiya X18 semi-gloss black, thinned with Mr. Hobby aqueous thinners. There's then, of course, some of the radiator components as well. So they are sprayed in one of the alclad aluminium shades. Again, trying to vary the shades as well, so it'll be different from one of the aluminiums I've used elsewhere, just to give that kind of visual variation in tone as well from the metallics. And then, of course, there's a few other parts that need to be sprayed in metallic colours as well. So, of course, once those parts have had a suitable drying time, it's back over to the main bench to add some ignition cables. So on the pictures, you can clearly see there's yellow ignition leads. They run straight off the top of the rocker covers and kind of sit underneath the intake chamber of the engine. So it's a simple case of just trimming off some yellow wire that I've got. It's a little bit thick for the scale, but it does look out and it does add to that kind of visual depth in and around the engine. So they're just super glued in place, and those wires will be trimmed back at a later stage to sit under the engine airbox. So I can now assemble up some of the radiator pods as well, because all the parts have been primed and painted. Again, that's using some CA glue. And then they can be popped onto the chassis, or the floor pan, basically. As you can see, there's one of those pods each side. And as you can guess, the engine is just going to nestle in between them. Just like so on its locating points. So that is basically going to be it for part 2. Let's head back to me for final thoughts. So there we have it. That's part 2 done. Of course, if you're new here, if you've not watched any of my videos before, please subscribe to the channel. Please give the video a like if you can. Really helps the channel. And feel free to leave a comment as well. And of course, for returning subscribers, thank you for returning. Thank you for watching. So that's gone reasonably well. some of the parts are quite fragile on this kit. So a bit of caution. I broke a few, managed to fix most of them, but it is very, very fragile. Generally, it's gone together quite well. Not sure why a lot of the parts in the kit were on a kind of chrome tree. I think most of them need to be painted anyway, so that's always a bit pointless for manufacturers. But that aside, the build up of the engine and the floor pan has gone really, really well. So pleased with that so far. So next steps into part 3, definitely be the monocoque, getting that carboned. Might get in the final assembly as well into part 3, but I'll see how the video footage stacks together. But as ever, that's part 2 done. Part 3 will hopefully follow fairly soon. And thank you all for watching. I'll see you all very, very soon. So bye bye for now.